Hello learners, welcome to this program. The topic of this program is Genesis of Instructional Design. I am Sutapa Bose. I teach at the School of Education, Indira Gandhi National Open University. During this program, our discussion shall focus on the genesis of instructional design. We know that so that teaching becomes a planned activity. So that teaching becomes a goal-directed activity and we remain on track while teaching, we remain focused, and when I say we, I mean teachers as well as students remain focused on what they want to achieve through the process of teaching and learning. And instructional designing is definitely teaching. Nevertheless, it is teaching which is carried out in a planned way, which deliberately includes certain elements like the sequence of what to teach when. Of course, it begins with why to teach, and then after that selecting learning experiences, what to teach when, and I mean that we have to sequence the learning experiences, and after that we decide that in order to attain the goals of teaching, what should be taught and when it should be taught, in which sequence and how it should be taught, and then we also assess whether our teaching has been effective. So this makes teaching instructions. How did this process begin? How did we start the process of instructional designing? Today we are going to discuss this aspect of instructional design, that is its genesis. First of all, an overview of the content. What are the things that we shall focus on during the discussion on this topic? We shall describe the genesis of instructional designing along a timeline, starting from the beginning and till very recent times, and our timeline shall have points which have been important for developing the concept, the idea of instructional designing, and very briefly about how to design instructions. The second part would be dealt with in a very brief way. Mainly the focus would be on the genesis of instructional designing. How did the idea of instructional designing gain ground? Well, some authors say that instructional designing has its roots in military training. Yes, you have heard it right, military training. Military training is also a planned activity, and I have said at the very outset that instructional designing is carried out for making teaching a planned activity. When soldiers are trained for their military activities, when they go out to battles, and there are military activities not just pertaining to battlefield but outside as well, they need to be trained, and training also involves teaching, and teaching has to be planned. Therefore, in order to make teaching a planned activity at military academies, at military training centers, instructional designing took root. During the Second World War, Western countries, especially the United States of America, had to train a large number of soldiers. A large number of military personnel had to be trained. The military personnel, in a systematic way, in a goal-directed way, it was realized that there is a need for making teaching a planned activity. It is said, as per some authors, it is said that the Division of Visual Aids for War Training of the US Office of Education had produced hundreds of films and training handbooks for military training programs. You see that films were used as a medium, training handbooks were again used as a medium for delivering instructions, and these films were developed, these training handbooks were developed, keeping in view the goal of the training program. Visual teaching aids were used like motion pictures, films. There were also silent movies, talkies, and manuals, print-based manuals. We use print-based manual as the master medium even today in distance education, and many distance education institutions still rely on printed manuals. But when we develop manuals for delivering through the print medium, we carry out the process of development in the light of the goals of teaching. And we also take into consideration the factors that would make these manuals effective pedagogic tools. If we are using films, we make sure that a video program or a film is pedagogically sound. In other words, it is powerful enough to teach. It is not necessary that we always develop materials. We always develop films and video programs and manuals. If there is a repertoire of these things, we can select those that would suit our purpose and use these. But then again, the selection becomes a process which needs care. We need to select judiciously. And what do we mean by judicious selection? Something that would help us to fulfill the goal of teaching. Therefore, every process, every activity, every element is as per the goal of the training program or teaching. And this was realized during the Second World War. And training programs were designed accordingly. Therefore, teaching started to become a planned activity, and inputs were provided as per the plan for attaining predetermined goals. However, some authors say that the concept of instructional designing is much older than the military trainings that I have just referred to, and this can in fact be traced back to the beginning of the last century. At the beginning of the 20th century, many scientists, or many social scientists rather, were working in this field so that instructions could be imparted in order to attain the goals of teaching. In 1920s, it was Tyler's idea of setting objectives of learning, formulating objectives, articulating objectives with clarity in a specific manner, so that later on we can match the learning outcomes with what we had aimed for. This was Tyler's idea 100 years back, more than 100 years back, and also several decades before the Second World War. So we see that it was 100 years back, more than 100 years back, Tyler came up with this idea, and also several decades before the Second World War. Few years after that, since Tyler's idea of setting objectives, in 1926, Sidney Presser developed a teaching machine for imparting instructions in an individualized way. And as I said, that in order to ascertain whether the goals of teaching have been fulfilled, we need to assess learning. Only then teaching becomes instructions. Assessment happens to be one of the essential elements of instructions. And Sidney Presser's teaching machine did include an element for assessing learning. And what did he do for that? He included multiple choice questions. And there was also the provision for providing feedback. This is how he made sure to build a teacher within his teaching machine. If you go through the self-learning material of a distance education institution like IGNOU, you will find that we still follow this practice of including exercises for assessing learning, and we also provide feedback towards the end of the unit. So this also made teaching a planned process. After that, within a few years of that, in 1930s, there were attempts to establish a systematic planning of instructions. It was realized that, well, instructions need to be planned and the planning needs to be carried out in a systematic manner, and there were many endeavors in this regard. In 1940s, just within 20 years of what Tyler had started, there was a rapid development of instructional media for military training programs. Now coming back to what we had said at the beginning, that instructional designing, as per some authors, has its roots in military training programs. These ideas were borrowed and these ideas were developed, were strengthened, and complexity of these ideas also grew at the military training academies. It is said that during this phase, instructional designing became a special field of research. There was a lot of research that how could we make teaching more effective? How do we make sure to attain the goals of teaching? And it was felt that instructions need to be imparted with two general objectives. At that point of time, it was realized, and you will see that even now in distance education, we try to teach as many learners as possible in those military academies. One of the two general objectives was to train as many learners as possible within a short period of time. And we still continue with this objective. And using the most efficient available instructional means, such as written instructions in the form of manuals, in the form of self-learning materials developed as text, there could be films, and there could be some face-to-face components as well. This is how planning was carried out. These objectives of imparting instructions, you see, are relevant even today, and instructions are imparted using a variety of media: print, web-based media, we use video, we develop video programs for teaching, there are audio programs, and as I have said at the outset that at military academies, films were used. And the same happens even now when we use educational videos. And either we develop this or we select this judiciously. These are still used for teaching many learners. Number one. The second aspect is that we intend to teach these learners within a short period of time. One example here. IGNOU's B.Ed program enrolls about 2,500 students annually. 2,500 students are being taught within 2 years. So this is a short period of time, and you see the number happens to be quite large. Therefore, what had been visualized then several decades back at the military academies continues even today. In the late 1940s, the principles of cybernetics, such as setting a goal, taking controlled action to achieve it, getting feedback, was also a step towards planning instructions. Well, I have just given the example of IGNOU self-learning material, wherein we include exercises for assessing learning, activities for assessing learning. And these are tools of assessment. And as I have said that there is also a provision of providing feedback. The feedback is there towards the end of the unit. Therefore, in 1940s, with the development of the principles of cybernetics and also with the principles gaining popularity, we started to set goals and we made instructions a controlled procedure. Well, instructions are designed or planned, but it doesn't mean that the planning is so rigid that it cannot be altered. Of course, instructions are more controlled than informal teaching. Nevertheless, you should not consider that if we have a plan in place and when you are teaching in a classroom situation or you are teaching online, that you do not have the freedom and the flexibility to deviate from the plan in keeping with the demands of the teaching learning situation. A plan is very much there in place so that our teaching learning activities stay focused, our teaching learning activities remain on track. Nevertheless, we shouldn't be considering it as a totally rigid plan. And in 1949, Ralph Tyler outlined 4 steps of curriculum development. These are determination of objectives, that why am I teaching? This is very important. Whenever I teach, whether I teach in a classroom or I teach in an online situation, I should ask myself, why am I teaching? What are going to be my objectives? What purpose would it serve? How would my learners benefit? This helps us to set objectives. This helps us to identify learning experiences. When we select the learning experiences, we do so keeping in view the objectives. We organize the educational experiences, like what to teach first, what to teach subsequently, what to teach towards the middle and what to teach towards the end. For example, instructional designing. A teacher might be teaching the concept of instructional designing at the beginning. She might then teach the genesis of instructional designing, and after that the benefits of instructional designing, and finally how to design instructions. Well, there could be many other aspects in between, but this is how organization of learning experiences is carried out. And finally, evaluation of learning experiences. We were discussing about the developments in 1940s. In 1958, these developments continued through the 50s, and in 1958 there was a milestone attainment when B.F. Skinner, an American psychologist, he developed a teaching machine. We have already discussed a teaching machine that was developed way back in the 20s, and in 1958 B.F. Skinner developed a teaching machine and he introduced the concept of programmed instructions. Programmed instructions, what does it mean? It means designing instructions and the content that we intend to teach is selected in view of goals of teaching. Therefore, we begin with learners' needs. We assess what their learning needs are. We set goals and after that we select the content, the learning experiences. We sequence the various aspects of the content. We segment it. And these small segments or chunks are known as frames. And while moving from one frame to another, the learner assesses herself, assesses her learning with the help of the assessment exercises that we include. And this is how learning continues and learning progresses. This was also the basis of the systems approach, which became quite popular during the 50s and the 60s. The systems approach also underlined the need for setting objectives and planning instructions accordingly. The concept of instructional design, therefore, is based on the concept of systems approach. What is a system? A system is an assembly of interrelated parts or elements, and change in one or more parts or elements of a system would impact the whole system. Therefore, these parts do not work in isolation but are quite interrelated. And the system as a whole has goals that are attained through appropriate inputs. The output of the system are then assessed on the basis of these goals. For example, if you have a cooling machine and your goal is that the cooling machine should bring down the temperature of your room to say 18 degrees Celsius. So this is your goal. The machine or the system is built accordingly. The inputs or the machinery that goes into it are designed accordingly, and you check the machine. If it actually brings down the temperature to 18 degrees Celsius even on a very hot day, you say that, well, the goals have been attained. If that doesn't happen, what do? You bring about certain changes in the system. The inputs are altered, and if the goals are attained, it is okay. Otherwise, you carry out more alterations. A teaching learning process is also an example of a system. As course planners, what do? We begin with the assessment of students' needs, that what do they want to learn, what do they need to learn, and then we set goals for instruction. For example, my student is not very clear about the difference between teaching and instructions. Therefore, my goal is to help the learner to clarify how instructions are different from teaching. And this helps us to rationalize what should be taught. If someone asks me, why are you teaching instructional designing? My reason would be that, well, this is my goal, that is because this happens to be my learner's needs. If someone asks me that why have you included these learning experiences, the inputs, I would say that these inputs would help me attain the goals with which I have begun. And finally, I would assess the outputs. Are my learners in a position to actually differentiate between teaching and instructions after I have imparted the instructions? If yes, then I would say that my goals have been attained. If no, I would have to alter my inputs. Go back to the selection of learning experiences. Maybe I have not selected the right learning experiences. Maybe I have not transacted the learning experiences in the way which would have been effective. Therefore, when we assess students' performance vis-a-vis the goals and alter inputs, we bring about alterations in the system in order to make sure that we attain the goals. And this is why setting goals, selection of learning experiences, assessment, these are all crucial to instructional designing. I said at the outset that our discussion would be organized along a timeline. We have covered till 50s. In 1962, Robert Glaser described an instructional system. He said that it comprises instructional goals, inputs, instructional procedures, performance assessment, and evaluation. There were also researches on computer-assisted instructions during this phase, and in the 1960s, computer-assisted instructions too followed the path of instructional design. The concept of criterion referenced assessment developed by Glaser in 1963 was in keeping with such developments. Why? That's because It intends to assess whether learners can perform specific learning tasks following instruction. These developments have in common certain things. What are these? The attempt to systematize teaching learning process by predetermining goals of learning, providing suitable learning experiences as inputs, ascertaining, checking whether learners' performance matches the goals, and providing feedback to learners so that they may bring about changes. They may go back maybe to the beginning of the module, to the beginning of the frame and learn again. It is clear that behaviorism, which was the predominant approach to learning in this period, guided these developments. In 1962, Glaser introduced the term instructional design, and the concept of instructional design subsequently gained importance, and because of extensive research in this field, it has emerged as a discipline. Therefore, we see that instructional designing, which is now integral to planned systematic teaching and learning, has evolved as an area of study, as a discipline. And you have read that, you have also heard that instructional designing involves systematizing instructions by structuring it into inputs, assessment of outputs in order to check whether these are as per the goals, and we give feedback. These steps comprise the behavioristic approach as well. Instructional designs were thus initially behavioristic, but later on, when other approaches to learning became popular, like the cognitivist approach, the constructivist approach, there were changes in the approach to instructional designing. In 1965, Robert Gagne had published The Conditions of Learning, which originally had a behavioristic orientation. But later on, it acquired a cognitive orientation for instructional designing. Later, instructional designs with constructive approach have also been developed. So, this is what it refers to, the evolution of instructional designing, which has kept pace with the various approaches to learning which have come up after behaviorism. This is how instructional designing has come into being, and we have also covered how instructional designs are developed, mainly using 4 steps, that is articulating the goals, determining learners' needs and accordingly learning experiences, assessing learning and providing feedback, and if required, giving or making suitable changes in the inputs. Thank you.